I worked in family law for 31 years. I saw the inside of courtrooms that smelled like old carpet and anxiety. I sat across from women who couldn't make eye contact. I read affidavits that kept me awake at 3 in the morning. I thought I understood what it looked like. Abuse hiding inside a marriage. I thought I could spot it from a distance. I was wrong. When it was my own daughter, I missed it for almost 2 years. Her name is Thea. She was 34 when she met him at a conference in Toronto. He was presenting a paper on urban planning, something about transit corridors and mixed-use zoning, and she told me later that he raised his hand during the Q&A and asked the sharpest question in the room. She said she noticed him because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to understand. His name was Griffin. He called her 3 days after they exchanged numbers. Not right away, not frantically, but 3 days, which she thought showed self-possession. He took her to a small Italian place on Dundas West. Not expensive, but thoughtful. He remembered she'd mentioned being vegetarian in passing and had already checked the menu. He brought a book she'd said she wanted to read. He listened when she talked. I met him at Thanksgiving that first year. We were at my house in Hamilton, the one I've had since her father and I divorced, the one with the wraparound porch that needs repainting every few years. But I can't bring myself to change the color because Thea picked it when she was 9. Terracotta. She called it the color of something warm. Griffin shook my hand with both of his. He brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a jar of local honey from a farm near Niagara-on-the-Lake. He helped clear the table without being asked. He asked me about my work. Genuinely asked, not the polite half-question people use to fill silence. He wanted to know what family law actually looked like from the inside. We talked for almost an hour after Thea went to help her aunt in the kitchen. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. I liked him very much. They were engaged 14 months later, a small ceremony at a vineyard in Prince Edward County, maybe 60 people, cedar chairs on a hillside, Thea in a dress the color of cream. She looked the way people look in the moments they'll describe for the rest of their lives. Open, unlocked. I gave a short speech. I said Griffin had a quality that was rare in people. He paid attention. I meant it as a compliment. I meant all of it. The first sign. And I use that word now. In hindsight, the way you use it when you're trying to make sense of something you didn't see clearly at the time, was so quiet I barely registered it. It was a Sunday in February, about 4 months after the wedding. Thea called to check in, which she did most weeks. We talked about her job. She was working as an environmental consultant for a firm in Mississauga, and about the ice storm that had come through that week, and about whether I needed help with anything around the house. At some point I mentioned that I had run into her university friend at the market, the one she'd been close with for years, and I asked if they were still in touch. There was a pause. Not a long one. Then she said, "Not as much lately. Griffin finds her a bit much." I asked what she meant. "Just, she can be loud. He finds it draining after a long week." I said something neutral. I moved on. But I remembered it, filed it away in some part of my brain that was already trained to notice things without announcing them. Over the next several months, I noticed that Thea called me less often on weekends. When she did call, she sometimes seemed distracted, slightly breathless, like she was listening for something in another room. She stopped mentioning her colleagues by name. She used to talk about the people she worked with the way she talked about characters in a novel, with affection, with detail. That stopped. When I visited them at their condo in Oakville in the spring, Griffin was courteous. He always was. But I noticed that when I asked Thea something, a simple question, what she'd been reading, whether she'd seen a film she'd mentioned wanting to see, she glanced at him first. Just quickly. Just a flicker. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were trained to look for permission-seeking in a person's body. I told myself she was adjusting. Marriage changes people's rhythms. I told myself that. I want to tell you exactly what happened the night everything became impossible to ignore. I want to tell you precisely because I think precision matters when it comes to this. Vagueness lets things stay comfortable. I don't want to be comfortable about it. It was late October. Thanksgiving had already passed. Canadian Thanksgiving, so early in the month, and Thea had suggested a small dinner at their place. Just the four of us, me, Thea, Griffin, and his mother, who had driven up from Windsor for the weekend. I had met her once before, briefly, at the wedding. Her name was Constance. Thea cooked. She'd made a lamb shoulder that had been braising since the afternoon, roasted root vegetables, a salad with pears and candied pecans. She'd baked bread. The apartment smelled extraordinary when I arrived. Constance was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of Bordeaux, watching Thea move around the kitchen the way you'd watch someone perform a task you were evaluating, not unkindly necessarily, but with an eye that was always measuring. Griffin poured me a glass of wine and gave me a brief tour of the renovations they'd done, new shelving in the living room, a built-in bench in the entryway. He was in good spirits. Expansive, even. He told a long story about a project at work that had finally gotten municipal approval, and Constance asked sharp, interested questions, and I watched how animated he became under her attention. We sat down to eat around 7. The lamb was exceptional. I said so, Thea smiled, the real kind, just for a moment. Then Constance cut a piece, chewed slowly, and said, "It's a little underseasoned, don't you think?" Thea said, "Oh, I can bring the salt." "It's not about salt," Constance said. "It's about building flavor before it goes in the oven. It needed a proper marinade, overnight at least." Thea said, "I did marinate it since yesterday morning." Constance took another bite, set her fork down. "Griffin, doesn't your grandmother's recipe use red wine vinegar?" Griffin said without looking up. "Mom's right. It's missing something." Thea said nothing. She reached for her water glass. I kept eating. I complimented the vegetables. I tried to redirect the conversation. I asked Constance about the drive up from Windsor, about whether the 401 had been bad, about whether she was staying through the weekend. Constance answered briefly and then turned back to the food. "The bread is a bit dense," she said. "Did you use the right flour?" I watched my daughter's face. She didn't argue. She didn't look hurt, exactly. She had moved past the phase where these things registered on her face. That was what frightened me. She had learned to go somewhere else, somewhere Constance and Griffin couldn't reach. Her expression went careful and still, the way water looks when it's very deep. Griffin said, "You should have asked me to check the recipe before you started." Thea said quietly, "I've made bread before. I'm just saying." He shrugged. "If you're not sure." I wasn't unsure. Something shifted in his face. It was small. The way a room changes when someone turns off a lamp in the corner, the shape of everything stays the same, but the light is different. "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "That tone." "You know what tone?" Constance was watching, not with alarm, with something almost like interest. Thea said, "I don't have a tone." He reached across the table and he grabbed her wrist. Not with the full force of someone intending to hurt, but hard enough. Hard enough that the wine in her glass trembled. Hard enough that the sound of the chair legs on hardwood when she flinched backward was the loudest thing in the room. He said very quietly, "I said don't." Constance made a sound. A short exhale that was almost, not quite, but almost approving. Like she had just watched someone handle a difficult situation correctly. I set down my fork. I have been in rooms where terrible things were said out loud. I have heard men describe in flat legal language what they had done to the women they claimed to love. I have sat across from those men and kept my face composed, because composure was the job. 31 years of composure. But sitting at my daughter's dinner table, watching her wrist, watching Constance exhale with something close to satisfaction, Every single year of that composure was the only thing holding me in my chair. I did not raise my voice. I have learned, over a long career, that raising your voice concedes ground. That calm is not passivity. That the most powerful thing you can do in a room where someone expects you to react is to not give them the reaction they're counting on. I looked at Griffin. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I'm going to use the restroom." I picked up my handbag. I walked down the hallway. I did not go to the restroom. I called my daughter's closest colleague, a woman named Philippa, who had been quietly asking me for 6 months whether Thea seemed all right to me. I had a contact at the Halton Regional Police Service from a case I'd consulted on several years prior. I had, in my handbag, as I always do out of professional habit, a small notepad on which I had already, over the past several months, written down dates and observations, things I had noticed, things Thea had said, then corrected, then said again differently, the way her voice sounded on certain Sunday evenings. I called Philippa first. I spoke for 4 minutes. Then I went back to the table and finished my dinner. I want to be clear about something. The law in Ontario takes domestic violence seriously, more seriously than it did when I started practicing, though not yet seriously enough. A single incident of physical restraint, witnessed, documented, is actionable. What I had were months of documented observations from a retired family law solicitor, a credible third-party witness prepared to make a statement, and a daughter who I believed, and was right to believe, would tell the truth if someone created the conditions in which she felt safe enough to do it. What I did not have that night was Thea's trust, not fully. She had been trained, carefully and over a long time, to believe that the problem was her tone, her bread, her wrist pulling away at the wrong moment. That's the thing about this kind of marriage. It doesn't happen with one dramatic event you can point to. It happens in increments so small that by the time the increment is large enough to see, you've already adjusted your whole life to accommodate it. You've already stopped calling your friend because she's a bit much. You've already started checking his face before you answer someone's question. You've already moved so far from yourself that the distance doesn't feel like distance anymore. It just feels like where you live. In the weeks that followed that dinner, I did 3 things. First, I called Thea every day, not to discuss Griffin, just to talk, to be a voice she recognized as hers, as coming from before. We talked about her work. We talked about her work. We talked about a podcast she'd found about migratory birds. We talked about whether to repaint my porch, small things, ordinary things. I was trying to leave a thread she could follow back. Second, I contacted a family law colleague in Mississauga, someone I trusted, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and asked her to be on standby. Third, I called Griffin's employer. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it matters. I did not make anything up. I contacted the HR director at the urban planning firm where he worked, a firm that had a clear workplace conduct policy, which I had looked up, and I shared what I had personally witnessed at that dinner table. A partner-level employee physically restraining his spouse in front of guests. I gave them my name, my professional background, and I told them I was happy to provide a written statement. I am not telling you this because it was easy. It wasn't easy. It felt, at points, like I was moving through water. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table in Hamilton with a cup of tea gone cold and wondered if I was overstepping, if I was making it worse, if Thea would be furious with me. There were nights I picked up the phone to call her and then set it down because I was afraid of pushing too hard and closing the door. But I also knew this. The longer it went on, the smaller she would become. And I had watched that process already. I had watched it for 2 years without fully naming it. I was not going to watch it anymore. Thea called me on a Tuesday in December. It was early, not quite 7, and the sky outside my kitchen window was still dark. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you some things. I said, I know. I'm here. She talked for 2 hours. Not all of it was linear. Some of it circled back, the way these conversations do, because the mind protects itself by not revealing everything at once. She told me about the first time he'd raised his voice, which had happened 3 weeks into the marriage during a disagreement about whether to spend Christmas with her family or his. She told me about the credit card he'd moved into his name without telling her, the joint account she no longer had access to, the slowly narrowing circle of people she was allowed to see without it costing something, on the evening of silence, a pointed comment the next morning. A look that told her she had made a choice he would not forget. She told me she had not told anyone because she believed she had done something to create it. I said, "You didn't." She said, "I know that. I'm starting to know that." The formal separation process began in January. My colleague in Mississauga handled it with the kind of steady, unhurried competence that is its own form of care. Thea had grounds. She had her own documentation by then. She'd been keeping notes on her phone for months, longer than I'd known because some part of her had known too. We applied for a restraining order. We froze the joint assets before the dissolution, which in Ontario requires specific timing that I will not detail here, but which mattered enormously. Griffin's mother called me once. She told me I had destroyed her son's marriage. I said, "No, he did." I did not stay on the phone long enough to hear her response. Griffin resigned from his position before the HR process concluded. I don't know the details of what happened there, and I don't need to. What I know is that consequences arrived, and they arrived from several directions at once, which is often what it takes. Thea moved back to Hamilton in March. She's living in the neighborhood now, 15 minutes from me. She has a small apartment with south-facing windows, which she chose specifically for the light. She kept the terracotta color in mind when she painted the kitchen. She said she wanted something warm. She went back to work full-time by April. Her colleagues threw her a small, low-key welcome-back lunch, and Philippa texted me a photo of Thea laughing at something someone had said. It was the first photo of my daughter laughing that I had seen in over 2 years, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store and cried for about 10 minutes, which I am not embarrassed about. She runs now in the mornings along the waterfront trail. She calls me sometimes while she's walking back, not about anything in particular, just to talk, the way she used to. There's something I want to say before I'm done because I think it matters for whoever is watching this. If I had not spent 30 years in family law, I would still have seen what happened at that dinner table. The human part of it, the flinching, the wrist, the sound of the chair, I would have seen that as any mother would. But what the law gave me was the ability to do something with what I saw. Not everyone has that. Most people don't. So if you are watching this and you recognize something in yourself, in someone you love, please understand that you don't have to know the law to act. You have to know one person you can call, one colleague, one neighbor, one old friend who will believe you. That is your first call. That is all it is. One call. Because here's what I know after 31 years. The silence isn't protection. It never was. It just feels like safety because it's familiar. But familiar isn't the same as safe. Not even close. Thea's going to be all right. I know this. The way I know the color of my porch, the way I know her voice at 7 in the morning, with a certainty that has nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with knowing who she was before and watching her find her way back. She's almost there, and I'll be here when she is. What did the story bring up for you? And what city in Canada are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. I've been asked, since all of this, whether I feel any guilt about the way things ended for Griffin, whether I think I went too far. I don't. And I've thought about it carefully enough to be sure. Here is what I believe, not because any doctrine taught me it, but because 31 years of sitting inside other people's worst moments will teach you the same thing if you pay attention. The way we treat people follows us. Not as punishment handed down from somewhere above, but as consequence, the ordinary, unglamorous kind that accumulates quietly until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. Griffin treated my daughter as something to be managed. He did it so consistently, so methodically, that she began to manage herself on his behalf. That is not love, that is erosion. And erosion, left alone, will hollow out even the strongest foundation. Constance raised a son who believed that a woman correcting herself was more important than a woman being well. She sat at my daughter's dinner table, ate my daughter's food, and made a sound of approval when her son reached across and put his hand around Thea's wrist. That sound will stay with me for a long time. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. It was small. That's what made it so clear. That is who she had always been, and who she had made him. The consequences that came were not things I conjured from nowhere. They were the natural result of choices that had been made, steadily, over years. I simply stopped being the person who looked away from them. What I want to say, to whoever is watching this and recognizing something in it, is that intelligence without courage is just information. I knew things, professionally, that most mothers don't know. I understood the law. I understood the pattern. But knowing it and doing something with it are two entirely different acts. The doing required something else. It required being willing to be wrong, to be resented, to have my daughter furious with me, to make calls that might not work. Thea could have shut me out. She almost did for a few weeks in November, when she found out I'd spoken to Philippa. She called me and her voice was tight, and she said she wished I had come to her first. I said, "You're right. I'm sorry." And I meant it. But I also said, I was afraid that if I waited, there would be less of you left to come to. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Yeah." That conversation was its own kind of turning point. Not dramatic, not a scene. Just two people being honest with each other across a phone line on a Tuesday evening in November with the sleet coming down outside. The strength Thea has now, and she has real strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She built that herself. I didn't build it for her. What I did was keep the door open long enough for her to find her way back through it. That's all a mother can do in the end. You cannot want someone's freedom more than they want it, but you can refuse to pretend that their cage is furniture. She painted her kitchen terracotta. She runs in the mornings. She calls me from the trail. That is enough. That is everything.